Hello everyone. Tonight we're beginning with a subject that manages to be both invisible and horrifying at the same time. What it actually meant to be a woman in ancient tribal life. Forget the romantic daydreams of painted faces around a fire, or mothers tenderly singing to the moon. In reality, being born female was less a gift from the gods, and more like drawing the short straw before you even took your first breath. Imagine this: your very first cry was judged not for its strength, but for its usefulness. Because if you were born a girl, you might be left outside the hut, as your family decided whether you were worth feeding. Fast forward a few years, and you're not playing games with other children. You're hauling water jars bigger than your torso, because that's how you prove your right to exist. Then comes puberty, and instead of a cake or candles, you're locked away in a dark hut for days, while the rest of the village debates how many goats you're worth in marriage negotiations. And that's before we even get to childbirth, accusations of witchcraft, or the cheerful little tradition of being blamed if the crops failed. So, if you thought tribal life was all harmony with nature and communal warmth, you're in for a correction. The kind of correction that sounds suspiciously like endless labor, exile huts, and punishments wrapped in ritual. Now, if this mix of grim history and dry humor speaks to you, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy these strange journeys I drag you on. Otherwise, keep scrolling. The internet is full of lighter distractions, and since this little corner of the channel is a global gathering place, I'd love for you to drop a comment below. Where are you watching from, and what time is it there? It's oddly comforting to imagine someone in Tokyo listening at sunrise, while someone else in Sao Paulo is drifting off to sleep. So, settle in, let the room grow quiet. Maybe dim the lights, pour a cup of tea, or let a fan hum softly in the background. We're about to step into a story of silence, exile, and punishment, the hidden daily reality of women in ancient tribes. And the deeper you go, the stranger, darker, and more absurd it becomes. Let me tell you about the person you could have been, not the one scrolling on a glowing rectangle with indoor plumbing at arm's reach, but the one who just slid out into the world under a thatched roof and immediately disappointed everyone present by being the wrong sex. Yes, congratulations, you're a girl, which in many ancient tribes wasn't a blessing, but more like a logistical problem in human form. See, in plenty of places, from classical Athens to early Arab deserts, even in scattered tribal villages where resources were always tight, your very first breath was greeted not with joy, but with calculation. How much food do we have? How many sons already? Is this child going to help the family, or just drain us dry? Sons meant warriors, hunters, defenders of the camp. Daughters meant another mouth to feed, and, eventually, a dowry to scrape together before marrying you off like livestock with earrings. In societies where survival was a coin toss, that mattered. So what did families do? Sometimes, nothing. If by nothing you mean they left you outside. Female infanticide wasn't an invention of later civilizations. It was there in tribal cultures too, justified by tradition, hunger, or sheer preference for boys. Archaeologists dig up burial sites and find the numbers skewed, more males than females, and it isn't because the gods loved testosterone. It's because baby girls were quietly considered optional. If you did make it past your first few hours, you weren't suddenly secure. Your value still needed proving. In some regions of Africa and Asia, girls were accepted only grudgingly until they'd survived infancy and shown they were sturdy enough to haul water jars in a few years. Imagine that. Your ticket to life is your future ability to balance 20 liters on your head, no pressure. And the logic went further. Sons carried the lineage, the name, the land rights, things that patriarchal cultures treated like divine insurance policies. Daughters were destined to leave. Why invest heavily in something you're going to lose to another family? You were a temporary asset, raised for export. Some tribes literally calculated a woman's worth in heads of cattle, pots of beer, or strips of cloth. Your body was currency before you even had teeth. Of course, mothers didn't always agree with this arithmetic. Maternal bonds are stubborn things, and there's evidence of women hiding or protecting newborn girls against family decisions. But power wasn't in their hands. Fathers, uncles, clan elders, the men who decided whether the baby in the cradle was a blessing or a liability, held the right to choose. And when food was short, or wars drained manpower, the choice tilted heavily toward sons. You might think all this is ancient exaggeration, but it isn't. Written records from Mesopotamia, India, China, even early Europe document laws and customs that allowed daughters to be sold, exchanged, or, if unwanted, quietly erased. Anthropologists find echoes of it in tribal memory. A girl was rarely born into celebration, unless her father had the wealth to treat her as a luxury item. Otherwise, she was born into negotiations. And you, little newborn, still wrapped in scraps of cloth, already had an invisible contract hanging over your head, one that said, feed her, maybe, keep her, if we can, marry her, eventually. Because in a world where survival meant keeping the clan strong, a girl was not the promise of future glory, she was the reminder of future obligation. And before you've even opened your eyes properly, your fate is sealed. No toys, no lullabies, just whispered debates over whether you'll live long enough to braid someone else's hair. If you survived that first round of negotiations over whether you were worth the milk, congratulations, you're now a girl child in an ancient tribe, which is a bit like being a trainee, domestic appliance with legs. Forget the idea of carefree games, lazy afternoons, or a childhood the way modern people like to sentimentalize it. Your childhood was more of a probationary period before you graduated into permanent labor. By the time you could walk steadily, you had a job description. Tiny hands were perfect for grinding grain on heavy stone querns, a task so mind-numbingly repetitive that archaeologists today identify women's skeletons by the arthritis in their shoulders and knees. That's your first toy, a grindstone. No dolls, no skipping rope, just endless pounding of barley until your arms ache, because dinner doesn't cook itself. Then there was water. Someone had to fetch it, and guess who? Little girls, often barely taller than the pots they carried, were sent to rivers, wells, or streams, day after day, balancing jars on their heads like miniature draft animals in training. If you slipped and dropped it, well, that pot wasn't cheap, and now you're a walking disappointment. Some anthropologists say that across much of Africa and Asia, this chore alone defined girlhood. Childhood wasn't measured in birthdays, it was measured in how far you could walk with clay jars without breaking them. And don't imagine this was temporary until you grew older. No, this was apprenticeship for a lifetime of invisible labor. You were woven early into the rhythm of domestic survival, weaving baskets, spinning thread, collecting firewood, scrubbing hides. The division of labor was brutal in its simplicity. Men hunted or fought. Women and their daughters kept the world running. But here's the kicker. The very effort that kept the clan alive was dismissed as natural, unremarkable, almost invisible. Nobody carved your name in stone because you could turn a pile of grain into flour. No poet sang about the girl who made sure her family had water. You did the work, and the work erased you. There's evidence of this invisibility everywhere. Tools associated with women, spindle whorls, grindstones, loom weights are abundant in archaeological digs, but written records rarely mention them. Women's labor didn't count as history, even though it was literally what kept history alive. You weren't the warrior with the spear. You were the shadow behind him, making sure his spear wasn't thrown on an empty stomach. And the training was relentless. Play was tolerated, yes, but only if it looked suspiciously like practice for adult duties. Girls imitated their mothers, dressing smaller siblings, pretending to cook, plaiting straw into tiny mats. That wasn't play. That was rehearsal. Childhood joy was basically unpaid job training. Meanwhile, boys got a little more leeway. They could wrestle, mock, fight, or pretend to hunt, because their future roles were glamorous enough to allow some performance. But you were drilled early into silence and usefulness. If a boy came home covered in dust, everyone said, "Look, he'll be a warrior." If you came home covered in dust, someone scolded you for not finishing the grain. So, you grew up fast, not because you wanted to, but because the tribe didn't allow you anything else. You learned that tiredness didn't matter, complaints weren't heard, and curiosity about life outside the hut was a dangerous luxury. And before long, your mouth was quieter, your shoulders stronger, and your hands already cracked from work, all before you were even old enough to bleed. By now, your little hands are blistered from grainstones, and your spine is bending under water jars. But here's the real rule you're learning. Keep your mouth shut. In ancient tribes, silence wasn't golden. It was mandatory. Women's words were seen as dangerous, destabilizing, or just plain unnecessary, which meant your tongue was treated less like an organ and more like a liability that had to be kept under lock and key. Think about it. Across countless cultures, from the forests of Africa to the steppes of Asia, men gathered in councils to make decisions. Women, they were expected to sit quietly at the edge, if they were even allowed in the room. Your role was to listen, nod, and maybe serve the buyer. Speak out of turn, and you weren't a brave truth-teller. You were disobedient, rebellious, or worse, unnatural. And unnatural had consequences. In some societies, a woman who contradicted men publicly could be beaten. In others, she was accused of sorcery. Because what better way to shut someone up than to claim her words carried dark power? From the Iroquois in North America to the Dogon in West Africa, traditions grew around silencing female voices. Sometimes it was symbolic rituals of exclusion. Sometimes it was literal exile to a hut, or worse, banishment from the community. And don't think the rules were just about formal councils or politics. No, silence bled into every corner of life. You weren't supposed to question your father. You weren't supposed to complain about your husband. You weren't supposed to point out that carrying a child, hauling wood, grinding flour, and keeping siblings alive was maybe a bit much for one exhausted teenager. Complaints meant you were weak. Weakness meant dishonor meant punishment. So you smiled thinly and bit your tongue, because biting it was safer than using it. The irony is, anthropologists tell us women often knew more than the men did. After all, you were the one who tracked which herbs cured stomachaches, which river spots dried out first, which families were secretly starving. Women carried the practical, daily knowledge of survival, but they weren't supposed to say it. Men made decisions in the abstract, and if those decisions led to disaster, well, at least nobody accused them of talking too much. Even religious life wasn't a refuge. In many tribal cosmologies, the female voice was considered powerful but also polluting. Women chanting during the wrong ritual could anger the gods, so your prayers had to be private, whispered, hidden. If you wanted to cry out in frustration, you had to do it silently. The divine, apparently, preferred women mute. And here's the cruelest part. Silence wasn't just enforced from the outside. It got woven into you. You grew up internalizing that speaking too much was dangerous, that your thoughts were shameful, that your questions weren't worth asking. By adolescence, you'd already learned to censor, not because you lacked ideas, but because the cost of voicing them was too high. So, you became skilled at swallowing words whole, letting them rot quietly in your chest. And every time you lowered your eyes, every time you held your tongue, you rehearsed the role you were destined to play, the silent backbone of a noisy world. And just when you thought you'd mastered silence, nature had a way of dragging you into an even harsher stage, the day your body bled for the first time, and your entire tribe suddenly treated you like a walking danger sign. So far, you've been silent, busy, and largely invisible. But then your body betrays you. Blood arrives, not the heroic kind from battle or sacrifice, but the monthly kind, and suddenly your existence isn't private anymore, it's public business. Menarche, your first period, wasn't seen as a quiet biological milestone. It was treated like a political announcement. Here stands a fertile woman. Congratulations, your womb has just become a matter of tribal concern. In many cultures, the first bleeding came with ceremony, but don't picture flowers and cake. Think exile. Among groups in the Amazon, girls were shut away in small huts for weeks, forbidden to touch others. Their food passed through cracks in the wall. On the Andean highlands, seclusion could last months. Why? Because menstrual blood was feared. It was thought to attract evil spirits, spoil crops, sour food, even weaken hunters. You weren't a young girl growing up. You were a portable curse. In parts of sub-Saharan Africa, rules piled higher. You couldn't fetch water during your period because rivers might dry. You couldn't walk through the fields because plants might wither. You couldn't cook, touch tools, or sit near men, because who knew what calamity your uterus might unleash? The punishment for breaking these taboos could be as mild as scolding or as severe as beating. Some accounts even tell of women ostracized entirely if they were suspected of ignoring ritual restrictions. And puberty wasn't just about exclusion. It was about instruction. While hidden in those huts, you were often taught the litany of adult rules: how to behave as a wife, how to serve your husband, how to keep silent when ordered. Girls endured scarification, tattooing, or ritual fasting as part of initiation. Pain wasn't accidental. It was deliberate, a way to mark that your body now belonged less to you and more to the clan. In Polynesian islands, ceremonies included elaborate feasts where everyone else celebrated your fertility while you sat in the shadows, swollen with shame and obligation. In the Arctic, Inuit girls faced haircutting or ritual restrictions to mark the same transition. Wherever you turned, the same pattern appeared. Puberty wasn't yours, it was theirs. And if you thought menstruation meant new privileges, think again. It meant surveillance. From now on, your cycles were watched, whispered about, tracked like a seasonal calendar. If your bleeding didn't arrive on time, people speculated: pregnant, sick, cursed. If it came too heavily, you were considered dangerous. If it came too lightly, you were thought barren. Every ounce of blood was evidence, and the jury was the entire community. What little privacy you had vanished with that first stain. Your body was no longer your own rhythm. It was a signal flare, broadcasting to your family that you were ready to be traded, married, or impregnated. And before you had time to make sense of what was happening, your elders were already speaking in hushed tones about suitors, dowries, and alliances. Puberty wasn't a secret you shared with your body. It was a headline nailed to the tribal notice. And you, still aching and embarrassed, were shoved onto a path that narrowed into one destiny: marriage as transaction. So, your blood has barely dried from that first ritual exile, and already the real negotiations begin. Because in many tribal worlds, you weren't just a daughter, you were currency. Marriage wasn't a love story, it was an exchange rate. Families didn't ask, "Does she like him?" They asked, "How many goats is she worth?" Across much of Africa, bride price systems turned you into livestock arithmetic. A man's family handed over cattle, beer, or iron tools to secure your womb for their lineage. In other places, dowries worked in reverse. Your family had to hand over wealth just to get rid of you respectably. Either way, your value wasn't in your laughter, your intelligence, or your stubbornness. It was in herds, textiles, or jars of honey. And choice. That was an exotic luxury reserved for no one you knew. Fathers, uncles, or clan leaders made the deals. Your yes wasn't required. In the patriarchal logic of the time, women couldn't even own themselves, so how could they choose who owned them next? Anthropological records from Highland Papua to the Horn of Africa to early European tribal law all sing the same refrain. Women were transferred, not married. Once chosen, the process was heavy with ritual. In some native North American groups, marriages were sealed with gift exchanges of blankets, beads, or horses, tokens that symbolized the man had bought more than a companion. He'd bought labor, fertility, and alliances. In the Pacific, ceremonial feasts celebrated your new role while you sat quietly, a prized object being unwrapped. And don't romanticize this with the idea of "at least he'll take care of you." Often, the husband was much older. Sometimes, you were his second, third, or fourth wife. Polygyny wasn't just tolerated, it was prestige. The more wives, the more proof of wealth and power. Which meant you, young and uncertain, might find yourself competing with co-wives decades older, already entrenched in the household hierarchy, ready to put you in your place. As for affection, if it appeared, that was incidental. The purpose was alliance. Marriages tied clans together, secured peace between families, or reinforced political deals. Your uterus was basically the treaty parchment, and if you didn't conceive quickly, that wasn't your husband's problem. That was your failure. In some societies, infertility justified sending you back, replacing you, or keeping you in humiliating limbo, while another woman was brought in to do the job. And don't think widowhood offered freedom. If your husband died, you could be passed on to his brother in levirate marriage. Not because anyone thought you needed comfort, but because your reproductive potential had to stay in the family. So marriage wasn't your escape from tribal drudgery. It was an expansion pack. More work, more obligations, more surveillance. Now under a stranger's roof, you'd rise before dawn to grind grain for his household, birth children to extend his line, and smile politely at gatherings to prove the alliance was thriving. And if you dared to resist, to refuse the match, or worse, to run, That wasn't a romantic rebellion. That was dishonor. Families might beat you, exile you, or in harsher cases, kill you to restore their standing. Anthropologists have catalogued those brutal honor killings not as modern tragedies, but as old, persistent patterns. So, there you were, wrapped in ceremonial cloth, married off like a bargaining chip. No vows of eternal love, just the sound of cattle hooves in the distance, your true bride price walking away. And just when you thought you'd settled into this new role, your body reminded you what marriage was really for, not companionship, but childbearing. So, the marriage is sealed, the goats have changed hands, and now comes the part everyone was waiting for, your womb's performance review. In tribal life, a woman's destiny wasn't a mystery, it was reproduction, not optional, not negotiable, not yours to time or delay. From the moment you entered your husband's house, your worth was measured in children, preferably sons, and how quickly you could produce them. Picture it, you're barely out of adolescence, your hips still narrow, your body still catching up, and already there's pressure to swell with life. Across the steppes, in desert settlements, in forest clearings, the same demand echoed. Give us heirs, give us workers, give us proof that the alliance was worth the cows we traded. No child meant no security. You weren't simply a wife. You were an incubator on a countdown clock. And the risks, they were enormous. Archaeological evidence shows women's skeletons scarred by repeated pregnancies, pelvic deformities from childbirth, and early deaths linked to labor complications. Without midwives or herbs, labor could turn fatal in hours. Entire cemeteries bear the mark. Women buried with infants, sometimes with 2 or 3 small skeletons, reminders of how fragile both mother and child were. If you did survive, there was no recovery time. Nursing one baby often overlapped with carrying the next. Your body became a conveyor belt of fertility, barely given a chance to heal. And when malnutrition or disease hit, it was usually women who paid first. Nutritional studies on ancient remains show higher rates of anemia and bone loss in females, the result of pregnancies stacked on top of hunger. The cultural expectations didn't soften this reality. In many clans, a woman who couldn't bear children was treated as cursed or even dangerous. She might be divorced, replaced, or shoved into the margins of the household. Some societies allowed men to take a second or third wife if the first didn't conceive quickly enough, a quiet way of saying, you are disposable. Even success came at a cost. Bearing many children meant prestige, yes, but it also meant unrelenting labor. You weren't just giving birth, you were raising the tribe's next workforce, feeding infants while grinding grain, strapping toddlers to your back while hauling water, training daughters to repeat the same cycle. Sleep was rare, mortality common, and heaven forbid the children didn't match expectations. Too many girls, whispers started. A son who died young. Maybe you angered the spirits. Superstition wrapped around biology like a net, and you were always the one caught in it. Some cultures went so far as to blame a woman's impurity for sickly children, as though her body had betrayed the community by not producing robust heirs. The irony was sharp. Your ability to sustain life was treated as divine, but the toll it took on you was ignored. You might be revered as a mother of many, yet the moment your fertility waned, so did your status. So, childbearing wasn't a choice. It was the stage on which your entire value was judged, generation after generation. And just when you thought you could rest for a moment, the cycle of exclusion returned, because the very blood that marked your fertility also marked you as dangerous. And every month you bled, you were pushed back into exile. So here's the paradox. Your body is worshipped for its fertility, yet the very signs of that fertility make you untouchable. Every month, like clockwork, you're suddenly not a wife, not a mother, not even a human in the eyes of your community. You're a contaminant. Menstrual blood was seen as volatile. It could sour milk, spoil crops, ruin weapons, even call down spirits with very poor tempers, which meant you weren't allowed anywhere near ordinary life when it happened. Cue the menstrual hut. Across the Americas, in the Pacific Islands, in mountain villages, from Anatolia to the Andes, the story repeats. A girl or woman on her period was banished from the household. Sometimes it was a small shack at the edge of the village, sometimes a cave, sometimes just a rough shelter thrown together. Privacy, no. Comfort, even less. You slept on the ground, ate scraps brought to you, and endured whispers that you were dangerous, and childbirth. that was exile too. For many communities, giving birth inside the family dwelling risked polluting the space, so labor happened outside, in huts or shelters, often attended only by other women. The symbolism was blunt. Your greatest gift to the tribe, producing a new life, also made you impure enough to be cast out. You were too sacred to be near, but not sacred enough to be comfortable. The reasoning wasn't unique to one place. In Highland South America, girls stayed secluded for days during their first period, instructed not to touch food or tools. Among some indigenous groups of North America, menstruating women were forbidden to see the sun, believing their power could disturb cosmic order. In South Asia's foothills, families still built tiny chowpatty huts where women were forced to sleep during their cycle. Practices so persistent, they've only recently been outlawed. But let's be honest, this wasn't framed as cruelty. It was framed as protection. Protection crops, of men's strength, of ritual purity. What was never protected was you. Left alone in flimsy shelters, women froze, starved, or were attacked by animals. Anthropologists record deaths from snake bites, infections, or sheer neglect. That's the price of being treated as both sacred and contaminating at once. And of course, exile wasn't just physical, it was social. Those days or weeks away reminded everyone that your body was both indispensable and taboo. It trained you to see yourself as a cycle of usefulness and danger, never neutral. Imagine the mental toll of being told monthly, your body keeps us alive, but your blood might kill us. Even when you returned, the stain of suspicion lingered. If a hunt went wrong, if a harvest failed, if a child fell sick, the whispers often turned back to whether you'd broken the rules in your hut. Maybe you left too soon. Maybe you didn't stay far enough away. Your blood became the universal scapegoat. So every month, every childbirth, you rehearsed the same role, removed, contained, and quietly blamed. And when you came back, there was no welcome party, just the endless work waiting for you, as though nothing had happened. Which brings us to the next truth of tribal womanhood. Exile wasn't the only burden. Daily life itself was a sentence of ceaseless labor, where exhaustion was stitched into every sunrise. Back from your exile, no rest, no applause. You don't even get a welcome back, sacred polluter. What you get is work, and not the noble kind sung about around fires, not the spearing a buffalo, not the leading a war party. No, your work was the endless bone-grinding, back-breaking labor that kept everyone alive, but somehow didn't count as real. Start with food. Someone had to grind the grain, pound the roots, ferment the beer, and cook every single meal over smoky fires. Archaeologists can literally see the results of this drudgery in women's skeletons. Spines bent from hours at grindstones, teeth worn down from stone dust mixed into flour, knees shot from squatting on hard ground. Your kitchen wasn't a room, it was your body breaking down in installments. Then came fuel. Fires don't feed themselves, so you hauled wood or dung from miles away, often with a baby strapped to your back and another clinging to your leg. Ethnographic studies of nomadic groups show women walking hours each day just for firewood, and guess who still had to cook once they got back? That's right, the same women. Water was worse. Jars weren't light, and rivers weren't next door. In villages across the Middle East, the Pacific, and the Americas, women spent hours fetching and carrying heavy containers, daily marathons that left calluses on the skull from balancing weight. Think of it as CrossFit, except you didn't get abs or Instagram likes, just arthritis and childcare. Continuous. You didn't get to choose between motherhood and labor, you did both at once. Babies swaddled to your chest while you stirred pots, toddlers perched on your hip while you weeded fields. Anthropologists studying subsistence farming households found women routinely worked longer hours than men, pulling double shifts between domestic tasks and agricultural labor. Men might return from a hunt or a raid and rest. Women never clocked out. Even textiles carried their own tyranny. Spinning thread, weaving cloths, sewing hides. These were daily chores, not creative outlets. Excavations in ancient settlements pile up spindle whorls and loom weights. Mute proof of 1,000 lifetimes spent, twisting, knotting, weaving. Every blanket, every tunic, every rope was a woman's unpaid, unremembered masterpiece. And the kicker, none of this was seen as work. Men hunted a few hours a week and were praised as providers. Women sweated from dawn to dusk and were told they were just keeping house. History glorified the spears and forgot the grinding stones. But the exhaustion wasn't only physical, it was existential. You knew that no matter how much you hauled, cooked, spun, or carried, your labor would vanish into anonymity. No one recorded your names. Oral histories praised warriors, chiefs, shamans. Women were remembered only if they bore a famous son or caused a scandal. Everything else dissolved into silence. So, each day you worked yourself closer to collapse, unrecognized, unrecorded, and utterly expected to keep going. Because if you stopped, the household faltered, and if the household faltered, you'd be blamed anyway. And as if endless work weren't enough, hovering over all of it was the constant threat of punishment. Because one wrong move, one refusal, one accusation, one unlucky rumor, and the same tribe that depended on you could turn brutally against you. All that labor, all that silence, and still you were never safe. Because in many tribal worlds, discipline wasn't a conversation, it was a beating. Violence wasn't the exception, it was the system. If you disobeyed a husband, insulted an elder, or simply got unlucky with gossip, punishment was swift and very public. Ethnographic records from early law codes to oral traditions show the same patterns. Among clans in the highlands of Central Asia, disobedient wives could be whipped. In desert settlements of the Middle East, harsh codes allowed husbands to strike women who were rebellious. In island societies of the Pacific, physical punishment was framed as restoring balance, a poetic way of saying you'd be slapped into silence. This wasn't about crime, it was about control. And then there were the accusations. Step out of line, and suddenly you weren't just troublesome, you were a danger. Across the Americas, women who spoke too freely, or who failed in ritual obligations, could be branded as bringing misfortune. In some places, that meant banishment. In others, it meant execution. Because what easier scapegoat than the woman who already carried the stigma of impurity, infidelity, or even the suspicion of it, was another landmine. In tribal codes from the Near East to West Africa, adultery by a woman was punishable by mutilation or death, while male infidelity was often ignored. Why? Because a man's wandering only produced more children, but a woman's wandering threatened bloodlines, inheritance, and alliances. Your fidelity was never about love, it was about property rights. And sometimes, the punishment wasn't even for disobedience, it was ritual. Girls in initiation rites endured scarification, beatings, or painful ordeals designed to toughen them into womanhood. These weren't crimes you committed. These were milestones you endured, with scars as your diploma. But the harshest cruelty was how normalized it all was. Violence wasn't seen as abuse. It was seen as correction, purification, sometimes even divine order. Husbands justified it, elders condoned it, priests or shamans wrapped it in spiritual language. And you, the woman on the receiving end, learned quickly that resistance only multiplied the blows. Even when tribes had rules limiting violence, they were written by and for men. The Hittite codes allowed fines for certain assaults, but only if the man struck another man's wife too severely. The woman's suffering wasn't the point. The husband's property rights were. You weren't a person in that calculation. You were collateral. And yet, paradoxically, the same communities that punished women so brutally also depended on them, absolutely. Without your labor, the fires went out, the children starved, the fields lay empty, but dependence didn't soften cruelty. It sharpened it. The more essential you were, the harsher the penalties if you threatened the system by speaking, resisting, or simply existing too visibly. So violence wasn't random. It was the constant reminder that your body belonged to others, your husband, your clan, your gods, and at any moment they could mark it, bruise it, or break it in the name of order. And when things went wrong in the tribe, when the crops failed, when disease swept through, when storms tore roofs away, the punishments escalated, because someone had to take the blame, and all eyes turned to the same convenient target, women accused of witchcraft. Because when the rains didn't come, or when they came too hard, or when a child got sick, or when a goat keeled over after chewing the wrong shrub, someone had to be blamed. And spoiler, it was never the men in charge of rituals, or the elders who read omens wrong. No, it was you, the woman. Congratulations, you're not just a worker and mother now, you're also a walking scapegoat. The logic was flawless in its laziness. If misfortune struck, clearly someone had angered the spirits. If the gods were upset, someone had sinned. And since women were already polluting during menstruation, already suspicious during childbirth, already fragile in reputation, why not pin it on them? It was social problem solving by pointing. Anthropologists find traces of this everywhere. In small-scale communities from the Andes to the Pacific coast, women were accused of secretly cursing rivals or poisoning food. In medieval steppe villages, a woman whose children died in infancy might be labeled unlucky and cast out, as though grief weren't enough punishment. In highland South America, elderly women living alone were the first to be suspected of witchcraft when llamas fell sick or fields failed. The weaker your social network, the easier it was for suspicion to stick, and suspicion rarely ended with a scolding. Punishments ranged from exile, being thrown out of the community, to fend for yourself, to execution by fire, drowning, or stoning. Accusations of witchcraft weren't just insults, they were death sentences wrapped in ritual. What's almost darkly comic is how flexible the definition of witch was. If you spoke too much, you were a witch. If you spoke too little, you were a witch. If you were too beautiful, you tempted men, which if you were too plain, you envied others, which if you healed with herbs, you meddled with forces, which if you didn't heal, you withheld power, which no matter what you did, the category fit like a custom-made coffin. And of course, men were accused too, but nowhere near as often. Women carried the extra weight of being already marked as liminal, as in between, neither fully sacred nor fully safe. Anthropologists note how fertility and danger were always braided together in cultural imagination, that made women both indispensable and expendable, which is a dangerous combination when the reins fail. Even in communities where accusations didn't end in death, they still left scars. Being labeled a witch could strip you of protection, isolate you, ruin marriage prospects for your daughters. In tribal politics, reputation was survival. Once yours was stained, it rarely washed off. So you walked very carefully, knowing that a child's fever or a neighbor's dying goat could flip your life upside down. Every glance became risky, every mutter overheard a potential noose. And here's the irony that should make you laugh or wince. The very same people who called you a witch also came crawling to you when they needed cures. Women were often the keepers of medicinal knowledge, the ones who knew herbs, poultices, charms. Healing was tolerated right up until it wasn't. One successful cure, you're a wise woman. One failed cure, you're a witch. Same hands, different verdict. So yes, you carried water, you bore children, you kept everyone alive and still. In the end, you might be burned as the reason the river flooded. And when the flames went out, or the exile hut was locked, or the shame was carved into memory, your story was erased. Not even a warning, just silence. If you'd somehow dodged the witchcraft accusations, lived through childbirths, and managed not to collapse under the weight of endless labor, you might think widowhood would grant you some peace. A little freedom at last, no husband to control you, no in-law scrutinizing your obedience. Think again. Widowhood, in many ancient tribes, was less liberation and more like being downgraded to the fragile leftovers pile. The problem was simple. Your worth was tied to a man. With him gone, your position was shaky. In pastoral communities across Central Asia, widows could be taken in by their husband's brother, a practice known as levirate, marriage. Sounds practical, right? It wasn't for you. It was for the clan, keeping property, cattle, and children within the lineage. You weren't consulted. You were reassigned, like an inheritance item. In some places, remarriage was forbidden. Among certain indigenous groups in the Americas, widows were expected to remain loyal to their dead husbands, sometimes for life. That didn't mean they were honored. It often meant they were left impoverished, with no land, no security, and no voice. In parts of South Asia, widowhood was so stigmatized that women were stripped of jewelry, forced into plain clothing, and made to live on the margins, as if their very existence was a reminder of misfortune. And it got worse. In some societies, widowhood came with suspicion. If your husband died suddenly, whispers might circulate. Did she poison him? Did she curse him? Widowhood could slide dangerously close to witchcraft territory. Suddenly, you weren't a grieving wife. You were a potential murderer. Even when communities didn't actively persecute widows, they often abandoned them. Anthropologists studying nomadic groups found widows and their children among the most vulnerable populations, left to beg or rely on distant relatives. Without a male protector, your survival odds plummeted. And let's not gloss over the brutal extremes. In certain ritual systems, widowhood wasn't meant to last long because you were expected to die with your husband. Funeral rites in parts of India demanded that widows immolate themselves on their husband's pyres, a practice that, though much later codified as sati, had deep tribal and ritual roots. In some warrior societies, widows were strangled or buried alongside their husbands, their deaths reframed as loyalty. No one asked if you were loyal. Your body was simply folded into his grave goods. For those who did survive, old age as a widow rarely offered respect. In patriarchal lineages, men gained honor as they aged. They became elders, advisors, storytellers. Women became liabilities, mouths to feed without wombs to offer. Unless you were a midwife or healer, roles that carried their own risks of being labeled dangerous, your presence was tolerated, not celebrated. So widowhood wasn't the quiet twilight of life. It was a cliff. One moment you had a place, however restricted. The next, you were hovering at the edge of exile, suspicion, or destitution. And if you thought silence could save you here, you were wrong. Because with no man to shield you, your silence wasn't protective anymore. It was just invisible. And invisibility in tribal life meant one thing: no power, no safety, and no guarantee you'd survive the next lean season. By now, you've worked, bled, birthed, endured, maybe even buried a husband or two, and you'd think, surely this buys a seat at the table. Maybe a say in what happens to the community you've literally kept alive with your hands and body. No, tribal politics had a strict dress code, male only. In councils across the plains, forests, and deserts, decisions were made by men with spears, staffs, or just louder voices. Women, you might sit nearby, but only as background scenery, pouring drinks or tending fires. If you spoke, it wasn't considered input, it was interruption. And interruptions weren't forgiven icily. Of course, there were exceptions. In some matrilineal societies, descent passed through women, but don't get too excited. That didn't mean women ruled. It meant men traced their inheritance through their mothers, while women themselves stayed silent in the shadows. Even when women were shamans or oracles, their voices were framed as borrowed from the spirits, not their own. Power was tolerated only if it was cloaked in mysticism, and religious spaces, mostly barred. Temples, shrines, sacred fires, these were guarded by rules that marked women as too impure to enter, especially during menstruation. You might serve as dancers, singers, or ritual assistants, but never the high priest, never the officiant. The divine stage was for men in feathers and paint, not for you. Even within households, authority wasn't yours. You could run the daily operations, cooking, weaving, managing children, but ultimate decisions fell to fathers, brothers, husbands. Anthropologists note that in countless kinship systems, women's labor sustained the clan, but their voices carried almost no weight in governance. It was patriarchy disguised as tradition, enforced with ritual and repetition. And the cost of exclusion wasn't just pride, it was survival. With no voice in councils, you had no influence over land distribution, hunting territories, or alliances. If men decided to raid the neighbors, you went hungry while they played politics. If they decided to sell off grain, your children starved, and you still had no right to object. Silence wasn't just symbolic, it was enforced vulnerability. Some women tried to navigate it with subtlety, whispers behind curtains, influence through sons, careful advice to husbands. But even this carried danger. Too much influence, and you weren't wise. And manipulative women, as we already know, often found themselves accused of sorcery. The tightrope was impossible. Speak, and risk punishment. Stay silent, and accept erasure. And here's the cruel irony. When men failed, women were sometimes blamed for not speaking up. If a war was lost, or crops failed, or omens were misread, suddenly the accusation was, why didn't the women warn us? You were silenced at the council fire, and then punished for not preventing disaster. So, your life unfolded in this paradox. The tribe couldn't survive without you, but it also pretended you had nothing to contribute. Your labor was central, your voice peripheral, and the message sank deep. Be present, but invisible. Be vital, but silent. And just when you thought invisibility was the worst fate, marriage politics reminded you of another nightmare: polygamy. Because in many communities, you weren't just silenced, you were also one wife among several. competing daily in a household where rivalry was built into the very architecture. If marriage already felt like a transaction, wait until you discovered you weren't the only item purchased. Because in many tribal systems, a man's prestige was measured in how many wives he could afford. One wife said he was respectable. 2 or 3 meant he was powerful. 4 or more. Now we're talking legendary status, and for you, legendary misery. Imagine the household, a compound buzzing with children, co-wives, servants and in-laws, all orbiting the same man-like competing planets, circling a very unimpressive sun. Each wife managed her corner of the chaos, but the rivalry was constant. Who cooked better? Whose children thrived? Whose influence with the husband carried weight? It was a silent war fought daily over millet porridge and sleeping mats. And don't mistake this for solidarity among women. Anthropologists studying polygynous households from West Africa to the Pacific Islands found jealousy, tension, and even violence were regular features. Co-wives sometimes sabotaged each other's cooking, withheld food, or whispered rumors to undermine rivals. You weren't sisters in suffering. You were competitors in a game you never volunteered to play. The husband, meanwhile, sat back like a king presiding over his chessboard, his ego inflated by the sight of multiple women vying for scraps of his attention. If one wife displeased him, he simply rotated to another. If you fell ill, your absence didn't matter. There were spares. Your children were dragged into it too. Their fortunes rose or fell with your position in the household. If another wife gained favor, her sons edged closer to inheritance, her daughters scored better marriage alliances, and your children slid quietly down the ladder. Mothers maneuvered fiercely to protect their offspring, because in polygamy, love was rationed through power. And if you dared to protest, to complain about being sidelined, or to resist your husband's next bride, the system had built-in answers. You'd be labeled jealous, disobedient, ungrateful, a woman unfit to manage the complexities of a great household. Some communities even had proverbs mocking the quarrels of co-wives, reducing your suffering to comedy. The irony is, for the men, polygamy wasn't just about lust. It was economics and politics. Each wife brought labor, fields, or alliances. Your marriage was less a love story than a corporate merger. And like in any business, the boss had favorites, and the rest were expected to smile through clenched teeth. Some women managed to carve power from it. The senior wife, often the first married, sometimes ruled the domestic domain with iron authority. But that wasn't equality. That was climbing to the top of a cage and declaring yourself free. The bars were still there. So, your married life wasn't just servitude. It was competition, relentless, exhausting, and dangerous. Because if you lost the rivalry, you didn't just lose status. You risked your children's futures, your own security, even your daily food. And when your youth faded and your fertility waned, polygamy had one more lesson. Your rivals didn't disappear. They outlasted you, which meant growing old didn't mean gaining respect. It often meant sliding quietly into the background, tolerated only as long as you weren't in the way. So, you've survived childhood drudgery, ritual exile, childbirth roulette, accusations of witchcraft, polygamous rivalries, and maybe even outlived your husband. You'd think, finally, old age, a little authority, maybe some wisdom cred. Sorry, in most tribal worlds, becoming an old woman wasn't a promotion. It was more like being slowly erased while everyone pretended you were lucky to still be breathing. Men who grew old became elders. They got titles, seats at councils, first share of meat at feasts. Their wrinkles were badges of honor. Your wrinkles, they were just proof that you were no longer fertile, no longer desirable, no longer useful in the one role society valued you for, reproduction. You didn't become an elder. You became invisible. Unless, of course, you became dangerous. Old women who lived too long, especially without strong male protectors, often slipped into the role of scapegoats. In villages from the Andes to the Baltic forests, elderly women were accused of causing illness, famine, or failed harvests. You were too old to produce children, too poor to contribute much, and too weak to defend yourself. That made you the perfect target for blame. And if you weren't feared, you were simply neglected. Archaeological studies of burial remains show higher rates of malnutrition among older women than men, suggesting food distribution favored elders of the male variety. Women who had spent decades feeding others often ended their lives underfed themselves. Even in households, the slide was brutal. Younger co-wives pushed you aside. Sons grew up and married. Their new wives took over domestic authority, and you became the extra mouth in the corner. Daughters might care for you, but they were often married off, leaving you to fend for yourself. Old age meant dependence, and dependence meant humiliation. Were there exceptions? Yes, healers, midwives, and spiritual specialists. Some older women held authority as keepers of herbal knowledge, custodians of rituals, or guides for childbirth. But even here the line was thin. Revered today, suspected tomorrow. A healer who cured was valued. A healer who failed was dangerous. The tightrope never disappeared. And here's the cruel irony. For men, age softened burdens. For women, it just added new ones. Your body broke down after decades of overwork, but there was no rest. You were still expected to grind, fetch, weave, and help with grandchildren until you dropped. Old women didn't retire. They faded, still laboring, still overlooked, until death finally granted the recognition. Life never did a burial that might or might not even carry your name. So old age didn't crown you with wisdom. It peeled away your usefulness until you were little more than a ghost in your own community. And when you finally slipped into death, the story of your life wasn't recorded in myth or song. It dissolved into silence, as though you had never been there at all. And that silence wasn't accidental. It was the design, because when the past was told, women were left out of the narrative almost entirely. Which brings us to the final insult, erasure. And after everything, the toil, the blood, the children, the punishments, the rivalries, the endless service, you might think at least your story would be remembered. Some tiny recognition, a trace of your existence carried forward. But here's the final insult of being a woman in ancient tribes. History shut the door on you. The songs sung around the fire weren't about women grinding grain until their hands cracked. They were about warriors and hunters. Oral traditions praised chiefs, shamans, and heroes, not the women who kept them alive. Archaeologists dig up loom weights, pottery shards, grinding stones, the very tools of your life, but your name, your voice, your story, gone. Even when women were mentioned, it was usually as someone's daughter, wife, or mother. You were a footnote to a man's legacy, not a legacy yourself. And the irony, without you, those legacies wouldn't exist. Entire genealogies depended on you surviving childbirth, raising sons, teaching daughters, but when the tales were carved into wood or chanted into memory, you disappeared. The skeletons tell the truth, though women's bones show higher rates of stress fractures, arthritis, and malnutrition compared to men from the same communities. You can see the labor etched into the spine, the worn teeth from grinding grain, the pelvis reshaped from repeated childbirth. Your biography is written in your body, not in the myths that erased you. And when women do appear in myths, it's usually as villains, seductresses, witches, or cautionary tales. You were remembered not for the decades you sustained life, but for the rare moments you broke the rules. That's how silence works. It doesn't just forget you, it distorts you. Even now, when anthropologists reconstruct tribal life, they have to dig deliberately to find you. They look for the grinding stones worn smooth by generations of anonymous hands, for the huts built and rebuilt by women's labor, for the faint traces of matrilineal lines buried under centuries of patriarchal retelling. Your life is there, everywhere, but hidden, like a watermark on history that only shows when the light hits at the right angle. And that's the bitter comedy of it all. You carried the tribe on your back, but in the official story, you barely existed. The men got the statues, the myths, the heroic nicknames. It got silence, and exile, and punishment. So if you had been born into that world, into bone and smoke, and endless expectation, your legacy wouldn't be in words or songs. It would be in the dust of the grindstone, the faint grooves of the loom, the weight of jars carried down riverbanks. You would have been indispensable and invisible at the same time, the foundation everyone walked on, and the name nobody carved. And that, more than exile huts, or rival co-wives or bruises hidden under tunics, is why it sucked to be a woman in ancient tribes. Because when you were gone, history pretended you were never there. Across the world, blood was always a complicated thing. Shed in battle, it could sanctify land. Spilled in sacrifice, it might please the gods. But when it seeped monthly from women's bodies, it unsettled people in ways that lasted for millennia. Menstrual blood was imagined as volatile, a force too strong to leave unchecked. It was said to spoil food, wilt crops, blunt blades, even sour beer. To stand too close to it was to invite a kind of cosmic imbalance, the suggestion that nature itself might recoil in disgust. Yet, curiously, this same substance was also treated as powerful. In the Andes, it was linked to fertility and crop abundance. In certain Pacific societies, it was thought to attract spirits. Blood was feared, and blood was revered. The contradiction was never resolved. Communities leaned toward caution. If it could pollute or empower, better to keep it far away from the places where men made decisions, offered sacrifices, or plowed fields. The result was banishment disguised as ritual. Women who bled were not simply considered unwell. They were labeled dangerous. The cycle that marked them as fertile, the very process that allowed communities to grow, was reinterpreted as contamination. Anthropologists have found this logic across nearly every continent: the Nile Valley, the high plateaus of South America, Arctic hunting camps, Himalayan foothills. Menstrual blood became a cultural scapegoat, a universal explanation for anything that went wrong. The irony was heavy. Women were essential to survival, but their biology was treated as treacherous. The line between life-giving and life-threatening narrowed to a crimson thread, and it was easier for communities to cut that thread by pushing women aside. Better to declare them impure than to grapple with the unsettling reality that power could flow from a place men could not control. And so, huts were built. Small ones, crude ones, sometimes no more than a patch of ground at the edge of the village. Women were sent out, removed from hearth and shrine, stripped temporarily of belonging, a practice born not just of fear, but of an anxious awe, the sense that their blood might hold secrets too dangerous to mingle with daily life. This was the logic that created exile, and once the rule was in place, it became a ritual. The banishment wasn't random cruelty, it was institutional, expected, carefully observed. The world of isolation huts began with this belief that women's blood, month after month, was both too holy and too hazardous to remain among the rest. And from that fragile logic of pollution and power, entire systems of separation unfolded. Huts, caves, straw shelters, lonely corners of villages where women sat through days of bleeding, waiting for the moment when they could return, cleansed. Once blood was marked as too potent to stay among the living, the next step seemed obvious to many communities. Separation, not punishment, they said, but protection. Protection of men, protection of crops, protection of ritual order. The reasoning was slippery but persistent. If menstrual blood could ruin harvests or invite illness, then keeping it away was the safest precaution. So, entire geographies of exile were carved into daily life. In Himalayan villages, huts of mud and straw were set at the edge of settlements, close enough to be watched, but far enough to keep their supposed danger away. In the Amazon basin, girls and women were shut inside tiny shelters, forbidden to touch food or water sources. In Arctic camps, menstruating women slept apart, separated from hunting tools, as though the mere smell of blood might cause a spear to miss its mark. The logic extended to sacred spaces. Temples, shrines, or ceremonial grounds were off limits. In parts of the Middle East, women were barred from entering houses of prayer during bleeding. Among some indigenous groups of North America, menstruating women couldn't approach sacred fires or participate in communal ceremonies. Blood was not only impure, it was disruptive, a force thought to unbalance the delicate contract between humans and gods. This pattern carried a certain efficiency. Exile didn't require constant policing. The rule was known, the taboo internalized. Women were expected to remove themselves, and failing to do so wasn't simply disobedience. It was sacrilege. To break seclusion was to risk calamity for the entire community. If rains failed or game vanished, suspicion fell first on whether a woman had dared to stay too close. Anthropologists point out how consistent this was. Whether in stone villages, reed settlements, or nomadic camps, the idea returned. The menstruating body could not remain where life was organized. It had to be placed on the margins. The margins became ritual architecture: huts, tents, caves. Separation was turned into a kind of cosmic maintenance, a way of keeping balance through controlled exclusion. And once that system was in place, it hardened. Generations grew up seeing the exile not as cruelty, but as custom. Young girls were taught early, when the blood comes, you go. No argument, no choice, just a quiet walk to the edge of the village. Of course, exile was never comfortable. The shelters were rough, cold, exposed. Food was scarce, visits limited, dangers many. But the logic was resilient. If blood carried risk, discomfort was a small price to pay for communal safety, or so the reasoning went. And inside those huts, women waited, their lives paused, their labor suspended, their voices silenced for the length of their cycles, days lost every month, absorbed into the architecture of exclusion. What life inside those shelters looked like, the details of the daily isolation, is its own story, one where survival itself was often left to chance. The exile took shape in wood, clay, and thatch. Menstrual huts, those small and fragile structures, stood like architectural footnotes at the edge of human settlements. They were never grand, never built to last, because they weren't meant to honor. They were built for removal, for keeping women and their blood at a safe distance. In the humid forests of South America, these shelters were low, reed-walled chambers, barely large enough for a girl to lie down. Some were dark inside, their only light coming through cracks in the walls. In Himalayan valleys, the huts were made of mud and straw, perched near cattle sheds or riverbanks, exposed to cold winds and rain. In parts of East Africa, the house of seclusion was a simple lean-to, a structure that looked less like protection and more like neglect. For indigenous groups of North America, the space was sometimes more elaborate, a designated lodge, separate from daily life, where women gathered during their cycles. Here, the rules were strict. No contact with men, no touching weapons, no crossing near water sources. The lodge marked a boundary, visible and absolute. The idea stretched across environments: caves used in the Mediterranean hillsides, straw huts in South Asia, reed shelters on Pacific islands. Always peripheral, always temporary, always reminding the community where danger supposedly resided. Life inside these huts was monotonous, sometimes deadly. Food was delivered in small amounts, often left outside the door. Comfort was minimal. No bedding beyond straw mats, no warmth beyond a fire that might or might not be allowed. Wild animals were a real threat. In Nepal's practice of chowpatty, women have died of snake bites or suffocation in huts with no ventilation. The archaeology of such spaces leaves little behind: traces of ash, discarded pottery, worn earth, enough to prove that people stayed there, but not enough to humanize the experience. The huts weren't just about physical removal. They reinforced a social map. Everyone knew where the menstruating women were. The separation became public knowledge, a monthly reminder of impurity. Girls entering their first cycles faced not only blood but a visible march to the edge of the settlement, an initiation through isolation. And even in places where huts carried a softer symbolism, where women used the time to rest, to share stories, to form small communities of their own, the core idea remained the same. The hut existed because their presence in ordinary space was seen as too risky. These structures, whether mud-walled or red-framed, became permanent features of cultural landscapes. They stood as silent markers of taboo, of fear, of awe, of the uneasy reverence for blood that communities could never quite integrate into ordinary life. Inside, women waited for their cycles to end. Outside, life carried on without them. And in that division, seclusion became routine. But routine didn't mean safety, because daily life inside the huts was stripped down to survival, and survival wasn't always guaranteed. Inside the huts, time slowed into discomfort. Daily life during seclusion was stripped bare. No tools, no work, no companionship beyond whoever shared the cycle with you. The walls were thin, made of straw, clay, or wood. Rain leaked through, wind pressed in, and the floor was nothing but earth. Nights were the worst. Cold crept into bones, insects crawled across skin, and the isolation felt heavy enough to suffocate. Food was rationed, when it came at all. Meals were usually delivered by younger girls or children, left at the door without touch. Anthropologists note that in Himalayan chowpatty huts, women often survived on dry bread or scraps, since cooking was forbidden and no one wanted to risk contamination by preparing food directly for them. In the Amazon, fish or fruit were handed in carefully, as though passing poison. Hunger was expected, not exceptional. Fire was another problem. In some traditions, women weren't allowed to light flames, the smoke thought to carry their impurity into the wider world. In freezing climates, this meant shivering through nights that men in the village spent by huts. Even in warmer regions, fire was restricted, leaving women vulnerable to predators. Snake bites and animal attacks are still recorded in modern accounts of menstrual exile. And it wasn't only the body that was tested. The mind suffered its own exile. Cut off from conversation, from daily rhythms of labor and family, women spent days in enforced silence. Some cultures insisted they shouldn't speak during bleeding, that words themselves carried pollution. So voices were hushed, laughter forbidden, even whispers treated as suspicious. Silence wasn't rest. It was a cage. The irony is that this isolation was framed as protection. By removing women, the community believed it kept them safe from spirits, from angry gods, from the supposed dangers of their own blood. But in practice, it left them exposed to the very real dangers of cold, hunger, and loneliness. Protection was just another word for neglect. Not all seclusion was entirely bleak. In some groups, menstrual lodges became spaces for women to share knowledge, tell stories, or rest from constant labor. But these moments of solidarity existed only within the structure of exclusion, not as recognition of value. The lodge was still marked as a place of danger, its inhabitants still whispered about, their absence from daily life still treated as necessary. The conditions inside reflected the contradiction at the heart of the practice. Women were too important to be ignored, yet too unsettling to remain present. So they were set aside, left to endure days of discomfort until the community decided they were clean enough to return. But when they came back, they carried the mark of suspicion with them. Their bodies were reminders of danger, their presence still fragile. And that suspicion fed a broader cycle, one that linked menstrual exile to social status, reinforcing silence, obedience, and fear. Returning from the hut never meant returning as before. The seclusion carried a stigma that clung to women even after the bleeding ended. Menstrual blood wasn't just considered polluting, it reshaped how others saw the woman herself. She was treated as fragile, volatile, and vaguely untrustworthy. Suspicion worked like a background hum. A woman in her fertile years could never fully escape it. Neighbors might glance twice if she walked too close to fields. Men avoided food she prepared if they suspected her cycle hadn't passed. Even her own children could be taught to treat her with caution during those days, internalizing that their mother's body was somehow dangerous. Anthropologists note that in many tribal systems, this suspicion hardened into rules about social behavior. Women on their periods couldn't touch sacred objects, couldn't enter ritual spaces, couldn't prepare communal food. Some were prohibited from looking men in the eye. Others were told not to cross paths with hunters, lest their presence ruin the hunt. The message was always the same. Ordinary life could unravel if a bleeding woman forgot her place. This constant surveillance shrank social status. Men defined themselves through public roles, warrior, hunter, priest, while women were defined by private functions that turned them into liabilities once a month. Status wasn't about contribution, it was about perceived purity. And purity was something women could never fully guarantee. Suspicion wasn't limited to menstruation either. It bled outward into other aspects of life. A woman who challenged her husband or spoke too freely could be accused of being unclean. A barren woman might be suspected of menstrual irregularities that signaled hidden curses. An outspoken widow could be whispered about as someone whose blood had driven her husband to an early grave. And beneath it all, suspicion was convenient. It justified exclusion from councils, rituals, and decisions. It allowed men to claim that women's absence wasn't oppression, but necessity. The logic was circular. Because women bled, because they were impure, they couldn't hold power. Because they lacked power, their blood was proof of weakness. Suspicion was also contagious. Entire households could be viewed with mistrust if a woman was accused of breaking seclusion. If the hunt failed, if the rains stopped, if disease spread, whispers might begin. Perhaps a woman had wandered too close to sacred ground during her cycle. Her family paid the social price alongside her, and yet, the contradiction persisted. Women remained essential, bearing children, providing labor, sustaining life, but their value was overshadowed by this shadow of impurity. Communities needed them desperately, and distrusted them deeply. It was this paradox that shaped the rituals of seclusion itself. Practices that weren't just about hiding blood, but about teaching women their place in the hierarchy, reminding them with every cycle that their bodies were under suspicion, and those reminders became encoded into ritual. Each exile wasn't simply about sitting in a hut, it was about learning, through repeated practice, the rules of silence, obedience, and submission that structured the rest of life. Exile wasn't just sitting in a hut waiting for the days to pass, it was structured, rehearsed, and ritualized. Every action or prohibition reinforced the idea that menstrual blood carried invisible power, something both feared and controlled. Take the restrictions on food. In many regions, women in seclusion weren't allowed to cook, touch water vessels, or even draw water from the river. They might drink only what was brought to them, often in special containers marked for the unclean. Among groups in the Pacific, food was passed using sticks or leaves, so that no skin-to-skin contact could occur. The irony was thick. The very hands that prepared daily meals every other week of the month were suddenly treated like they dripped with poison. Speech was another target. Some traditions demanded complete silence. Others allowed whispers but forbade singing or laughing, as if joy could contaminate the community. In South Asia, ethnographies recorded rules forbidding menstruating women from speaking to men altogether. Their words said to carry a weight that could spoil crops or anger spirits. Silence wasn't merely a side effect of isolation. It was demanded, a performance of obedience. Physical movement, too, was tightly managed. Women weren't allowed to cross fields, touch tools, or walk certain paths. They were instructed not to approach hunting grounds, not to lean against trees marked as sacred, not to pass near shrines or altars. Even in cultures where menstrual lodges were shared, each woman had to follow prescribed ways of sitting, sleeping, or disposing of waste. The restrictions multiplied until daily life became a choreography of avoidance. In some communities, rituals extended into purification rites at the end of seclusion. Women bathed in rivers or were sprinkled with special herbs before re-entering the village. In places where water was seen as vulnerable to pollution, ashes, smoke, or sand were used instead, rubbed over skin as a symbolic cleansing. Without this final step, a woman was considered unfit to resume normal tasks. The rituals didn't just emphasize separation. They created a constant rehearsal of hierarchy. By following these rules again and again, women were reminded that their bodies required management by forces outside themselves. Men, priests, elders, or spirits. Obedience was not optional. It was the very fabric of purity. And yet, hidden within these restrictions, there were traces of paradox. Some societies treated menstrual blood as dangerously sacred rather than merely dirty. Women were seen as temporarily too powerful, not weak. Rituals then weren't only about pollution, but about containing this power, bottling it up until it faded. But whether framed as weakness or dangerous strength, the result was the same: confinement, regulation, and suspicion. What these practices made clear was that menstruation wasn't just biology, it was ritual theater. Each month, women performed exile, silence, and purification. Each month, they reenacted their place in the order of things. And with every cycle, the lesson deepened. Menstruation wasn't private, it was public knowledge, policed and ritualized, until it carved itself into memory and identity. Isolation wasn't simply inconvenient, it was lethal. Left in flimsy huts or caves, women faced the raw exposure of nature, and nature wasn't merciful. Ethnographic reports describe women freezing to death during winter seclusion, trapped in shelters without fire because flame itself was forbidden. In the Himalayan regions where chowpatty huts still exist, deaths from hypothermia continue into the present. Cold was treated as less dangerous than pollution, which is a dark kind of irony only tradition can sustain. Predators were another hazard. Secluded women, left on the edge of settlements, were vulnerable to wild animals. Snakes slithered in, leopards prowled near huts. Hyenas circled. The very separation meant to protect the village left women as offerings to the night. And if they were bitten, clawed, or dragged away, the community rarely read it as negligence. It was chalked up to fate, or worse, to the spirits punishing impurity. Hunger and malnutrition carried their own risks. Restricted diets meant iron deficiencies worsened during menstruation itself. Ironically, at the very moment the body most needed replenishment. Accounts from rural South Asia tell of girls collapsing from weakness while in exile, meals reduced to dry grain or bread. In some cases, no food was delivered at all, with the assumption that women should fast as part of their purification. Disease thrived in these conditions. Cramped huts with poor ventilation made respiratory illnesses common. Parasites and infections spread easily, worsened by the fact that women were denied water for washing. The supposed fear of polluting rivers or wells led to unhygienic practices that caused precisely the harm communities imagined they were avoiding. And then there were the subtler forms of danger, the psychological toll. For young girls experiencing their first period, being exiled meant fear and shame fused into memory. Sitting alone in the dark, hearing whispers outside but forbidden to join, they learned quickly that their body marked them as suspect. Anthropologists studying these practices often highlight this silent violence, the way exile imprinted obedience through fear, shaping women's sense of self before their adult lives even began. Death, when it came, was never seen as the system's fault. It was reframed as divine will or punishment. If a girl died from snakebite, her family might be told it was because she broke some hidden taboo. If a woman froze, elders might mutter she had wandered too far from the rules. Tragedy became confirmation, each death reinforcing the very practice that caused it. The cruelest part was that these deaths didn't stop the tradition. On the contrary, they became cautionary tales, warnings for the next generation: obey or risk the same fate. The system fed on its own casualties. But the dangers didn't end when women returned from exile. Suspicion lingered, and with it came the possibility of blame for any misfortune that struck the community afterward. Illness, crop failure, or hunting accidents could all be traced back to whether someone had kept the rules during menstruation, which meant exile wasn't just about surviving the days in the hut. It was about surviving the stories that followed you back. If exile was suffocating, breaking its rules could be worse. Menstrual seclusion wasn't a suggestion. It was law dressed up as religion, tradition, or cosmic necessity. And when a woman stepped outside that law, the punishments arrived with theatrical force. Among groups in the Himalayas, reports tell of girls beaten for refusing to enter menstrual huts, even after international campaigns declared the practice illegal. Local elders still enforced the rule, because disobedience wasn't framed as rebellion. It was seen as putting everyone in danger. A menstruating woman wandering through fields risked the crops, the animals, the weather itself. Who wouldn't discipline someone accused of tempting famine? Punishment often began with shaming. Women were paraded verbally through gossip, accused of endangering the community. A girl caught drawing water might have her pot smashed before her eyes. A wife discovered in bed with her husband during her period could be denounced publicly, sometimes in front of kin. Social humiliation carried its own weight. Isolation already branded women as dangerous, but breaking the rules made them reckless, selfish, almost witch-like. Beatings and physical discipline followed in many contexts. A woman who touched sacred objects during menstruation could be whipped, sometimes with branches or ropes, her pain a ritual cleansing for the contamination. In parts of sub-Saharan Africa documented by ethnographies, menstrual taboos were enforced with fines, beatings, or both, the severity depending on whether the community blamed her for illness or hunting failures. And then there were the spiritual punishments, which cut just as deep. A woman who broke rules might be denied participation in future rituals, barred from communal feasts, or excluded from fertility ceremonies. Imagine the sting. The very rites designed to guarantee a woman's children, her role as mother, were withheld because she had once stepped outside her menstrual hut too soon. Some punishments targeted her family, spreading blame outward. Husbands might be fined, brothers mocked, parents held responsible for not controlling their daughters. In tightly bound communities, collective punishment ensured compliance. No one wanted to pay the social price for a woman's defiance, so pressure came from every direction to keep her obedient. But perhaps the sharpest punishment wasn't physical or financial. It was the slow erosion of reputation. Once branded as impure, reckless, or defiant, a woman's standing never quite recovered. Marriage prospects dimmed, trust dissolved, whispers lingered. She became the cautionary figure other women were warned not to imitate. The cruel twist is that the rules weren't consistent. They shifted across seasons, generations, or even villages. A woman might keep one set of prohibitions faithfully, only to be punished for failing to follow another she hadn't known existed. The very ambiguity of taboos made women permanently vulnerable. You could never be sure you weren't breaking a rule, and that uncertainty kept obedience alive. Punishment, then, wasn't just retribution, it was pedagogy. It taught every girl that her body was both dangerous and punishable, that her safety depended not on her own choices, but on the approval of those watching, and those eyes were always watching, which meant that even when exile ended, vigilance didn't. It seeped into daily life, into marriage, into motherhood, into the very fabric of social survival. On the surface, menstrual exile was about purity, about keeping invisible forces from wrecking the crops, the hunt, or the spirit's temper. But scratch a little deeper, and you'll see the stage lights shift. This wasn't just about blood. It was about power, who had it, and who made sure others didn't. Rules about menstruation were rarely made by women themselves. They were dictated, enforced, and codified by male elders, priests, and chiefs. The irony is sharp. The cycle itself was beyond male control, so the response was to control everything around it. If you can't stop the bleeding, you can at least dictate what it means. And so menstrual blood was framed as pollution, danger, or mystical force, a definition that justified keeping women under constant supervision. Seclusion huts, while presented as protective, served as architectural proof of hierarchy. They physically reminded everyone who set the rules and who followed them. A menstrual lodge on the outskirts of a village was a silent but permanent monument. Here is where women go when their bodies speak louder than the men in charge would like. The distance itself carried the message. Men controlled the narratives of danger. A failed harvest could always be pinned on a woman who supposedly broke seclusion rules. A hunter's bad luck might be explained by his wife's menstrual impurity. Spirits didn't need to send omens when men were available to invent them. In this way, misfortune became an endlessly renewable excuse for keeping women under suspicion. Marriage deepened the imbalance. In many societies, a husband was tasked with making sure his wife followed the taboos. If she slipped, the shame and penalties often fell on him. This made men gatekeepers of obedience, incentivized to police their wives closely. Patriarchy wasn't just enforced at the top by elders, it was woven into the fabric of everyday relationships. Even in traditions where menstruation was framed as powerful rather than polluting, the management of that power still fell into male hands. Men became the interpreters of sacred danger, deciding when and how it was safe for women to rejoin society. It's a clever trick. Acknowledge the force, but never let the one who carries it hold authority over it. Women, of course, weren't passive in this arrangement. Ethnographies describe quiet resistance, small acts like speaking through the hut walls, sharing food secretly, or joking about the absurdity of the rules when men weren't around. Still, the structure of taboos made those acts risky, and the consequences for rebellion often outweighed the comfort of defiance. The power dynamic was less about menstruation itself than about its symbolism. It became a monthly reminder that women's bodies were not fully their own, that every natural rhythm had to be negotiated through systems of control. A cycle of blood turned into a cycle of obedience, repeated endlessly until it felt natural. And in that endless repetition, power solidified, not as brute force, but as a daily habit, so ordinary it became invisible. You'd think, with airplanes in the sky and satellites blinking overhead, menstrual huts would have folded into history like clay tablets or leech medicine. But no, exile hasn't vanished. It's just gotten sneakier, rebranded as culture when challenged, enforced less by ritual priests and more by ordinary neighbors with long memories. Take Chhaupadi in Nepal. It was officially banned in 2005, criminalized in 2017, and yet reports still surface of women dying in huts from cold, smoke, inhalation, or snake bites. Why? Because a law on paper doesn't erase fear. Families cling to the idea that if they break the taboo, the gods will punish them, not with police fines, but with disease, crop failure, or a lightning strike on the roof. Between bureaucratic law and supernatural threat, the latter often feels heavier. Other regions have seen practices shift, but not disappear. Instead of formal huts, women are told to stay in spare rooms or avoid kitchens. Restrictions continue quietly in rural India, sub-Saharan villages, and even among immigrant communities, where tradition travels in luggage better than contraband fruit. The exile might now be psychological. The whispered reminder that you can't enter the temple today, but the sting remains the same. Modern activists, often local women themselves, have pushed back hard. Campaigns link menstrual exile to broader questions of health, education, and human rights. Girls missing school during their periods end up with fewer opportunities. Women denied hygienic care suffer infections and stigma. Public health studies pile evidence against taboos, showing they're not just superstition but measurable harm. Yet resistance persists, because these rules are stitched into identity, and tearing them out feels like tearing out belonging. Ironically, globalization has amplified both sides. On one hand, women share their stories online, turning once hidden practices into global debates. On the other, conservative leaders dig in, insisting outsiders don't understand our ways. Isolation, once enforced by ritual, is now defended by politics, and so the huts may stand empty in some villages. But the silence around menstruation endures almost everywhere, in gossip, in shame, in euphemisms like the time of the month. Continuity isn't always stubborn tradition. Sometimes it's subtle mutation. Instead of exile, there are restrictions on diet, participation in prayer, or expectations to conceal blood as though it were a scandal. The hut becomes metaphorical, but the walls are just as thick, and change, when it comes, is rarely linear. A school program might dismantle taboos in one generation, only for the next to rebuild them when misfortune strikes. A drought, a flood, a pandemic, and suddenly old beliefs feel safer than modern logic. The cycle of exile, like menstruation itself, has a rhythm, fading, returning, never fully ending. What we're left with is a picture where ancient banishment hasn't disappeared so much as it's been rebranded, adapted, softened into forms more compatible with 21st century life. The exile huts may crumble, but the idea that women must step aside, that's harder to bury. And perhaps that's the real continuity, not the mud walls or the flickering oil lamps, but the enduring lesson that a woman's body is never just her own. It is always, in some way, claimed by the community. Across much of human history, silence wasn't just a virtue for women, it was practically a dress code, an invisible garment stitched onto the body more tightly than any woven cloth. A woman who spoke too freely risked being seen as immodest, indecent, or, in some places, downright polluted. Purity wasn't just about the body, it seeped into the very sound of speech. A quiet woman was a good woman. A woman who raised her voice, even slightly, was suspected of wanting more than she deserved. Ancient codes reflected this obsession with female muteness. In certain legal traditions, women were explicitly warned to keep their voices hushed in public spaces, as though words could carry contagion. A wife who remained silent in assemblies upheld not only her own honor, but that of her household. The logic was simple. If bleak, speech was power, and women weren't supposed to wield that blade. To control the voice was to control the body, and to control the body was to control the family, the property, and the lineage. Philosophers added their own varnish to the rule. In the writings of men who liked to imagine themselves the architects of civilization, silence became a form of female virtue. Talking too much, they said, revealed moral looseness, a lack of discipline, an inability to contain oneself. The unspoken message: if she can't hold her tongue, what else is she failing to hold? The irony, of course, is that these same philosophers filled libraries with endless chatter, but when women spoke, suddenly words were dangerous excess. This obsession with controlling women's voices seeped into daily rituals. Girls were taught from childhood to lower their tone, to let brothers speak first, to keep their remarks brief and deferential. In households where honor mattered above all, a woman's silence was advertised like a badge. She doesn't gossip, she doesn't complain, she doesn't answer back. Her silence became the family's reputation. Parents could boast about their daughter's quietness in the same way they might boast about their son's strength. Silence, then, was less a personal trait and more a public performance. It told the world that the family kept its women pure, that the household was orderly, that no scandalous echoes would leak into the streets. In marketplaces, if women did speak, it was often reduced to short, clipped phrases, with eyes lowered, as if every syllable cost too much. The very act of remaining quiet became a kind of labor, unpaid and unrecognized, yet essential for upholding the fragile scaffolding of male respectability and purity. In this scheme wasn't a spiritual abstraction, it was deeply practical, a currency traded in marriage negotiations and social alliances. A silent daughter was a valuable commodity, less likely to disgrace her husband, less likely to cause disputes within. Families who raised quiet girls increased their chances of securing good matches, ensuring the bloodline stayed untainted by scandal. The woman's voice, or lack of it, was not her own. It was a collective investment, carefully guarded. Even religious spaces reinforced this. In certain temples, women could pray but only silently, or with voices so subdued they seemed like whispers to themselves rather than proclamations to the divine. Silence became a form of worship, as if the gods preferred women mute. The implication was that a pure heart could be demonstrated by an absent voice, that holiness required soundlessness from half the population. The strange thing is how effective this policing of silence was. Over centuries, women themselves absorbed the lesson, teaching it to their daughters, weaving it into lullabies and bedtime stories. Silence became tradition, and tradition hardened into inevitability. That inevitability was never natural, but it was convincing enough to last. And yet, the silenced voice never entirely disappears. Even in the cultures most obsessed with purity and quietness, cracks opened in the wall of muteness. There were spaces where sound slipped through, where voices rose in ways not only tolerated but required. Which leads us into the next paradox. Those narrow and carefully policed occasions, when women were not just permitted but compelled to raise their voices. The irony of all this enforced silence is that the very same societies that wanted women quiet most of the time also carved out peculiar little niches where women's voices weren't only tolerated but demanded. Not in politics, not in law, not in the cheerful chaos of the marketplace, but in the shadowed corners of ritual where sound carried a different weight. In certain traditions, women became the official mourners of the dead, hired or expected to wail over corpses with practiced precision. Their voices, so unseemly in ordinary life, suddenly became indispensable at the threshold between the living and the gone. Silence at a funeral was seen as dishonor. Noise, shrieks, and sobs were the proof of proper grief. The same mouths forbidden to speak in assemblies were opened wide to cry the dead into the next world. Birth, too, had its soundscape. Midwives and mothers surrounded a laboring woman with chants, whispered encouragements, sometimes rhythmic songs meant to coax the baby into breathing. The paradox here is brutal. The most intimate and dangerous moments of a woman's life were accompanied by female voices, yet outside that hut or chamber, those same voices were stripped of legitimacy. Sound was framed as dangerous in public, but salvific in private, a convenient double standard, if ever there was one. Taboos also regulated exactly what women could and could not say. In many ritual languages, there were words forbidden to women, syllables too sacred or too potent to leave female lips. A single slip of the tongue could, in the eyes of a priest, pollute an entire ceremony. Speech here was both power and contamination, a fragile thread that could either bind the community together or unravel it entirely. And so women's words were not merely monitored, they were censored, pruned, and reshaped to fit into narrow channels of acceptability. Lamentation, singing at births, ritual keening, these were the officially sanctioned forms of female voice. Outside them, everything else was suspect. One might almost laugh at the absurdity. The same voice accused of impurity in everyday speech became holy when it echoed in grief or pain. It's as if societies only permitted women to open their mouths when life itself was cracking open. The first breath, the last gasp. Everywhere in between, silence was the rule. Yet this reveals something deeper about how power works. When women's voices were allowed, they were framed not as expressions of individuality, but as collective property. A wailing woman at a funeral didn't speak for herself. She spoke for the entire community, embodying their grief. The chanting woman at a birth didn't voice her own joy. She acted as a vessel for fertility, continuity, survival. Even the moments of permitted speech weren't really hers. They belonged to the ritual, to the society, to the structures that otherwise kept her quiet. And still, for many, these occasions became a rare release, a space where silence cracked and the body remembered sound. The bans never fully erased the instinct to speak. They only redirected it, channeling it into wailing, chanting, or whispering. That whisper, in particular, would become the most enduring form of resistance, slipping into kitchens, bedrooms, and courtyards. Because when words are banned in public, they don't vanish, they just learn to hide. Once the ritual wails faded, once the chants died down, the old rule crept back in: silence. A woman's voice in public was rarely treated as neutral sound. It was classified, almost obsessively, as shame. Not shame for her alone, but shame that splashed onto her kin, her husband, her lineage. A single loud word in the wrong setting could stain reputations the way spilled wine stains fabric impossible to scrub out, leaving a faint mark that everyone could still see. In many ancient legal codes, the logic was spelled out. A woman's voice was likened to her body, both requiring containment. Just as an unveiled face was considered indecent, a voice that carried beyond household walls was framed as immodesty made audible. Markets, council gatherings, law courts. These spaces were not built for female sound. Even when women entered them as buyers, sellers, or witnesses, the expectation was muteness. Speak too much, and suddenly you weren't just noisy, you were dangerous. Anthropologists have noted that across cultures, metaphors of sound tied female voices to disorder. A shrill tone was chaos, a public laugh was scandal, an argumentative remark was rebellion. The absurdity lies in how elastic these rules were. A man laughing in public was sociable, charismatic. A woman laughing in public was indecent. One chuckle could brand her as uncontrolled, and an uncontrolled woman was a threat. Some groups went further and regulated not only what women could say, but how they could say it. Pitch, volume, and delivery all became suspect. A voice that carried too far into the street was gossip. A voice too deep was masculine. A voice too soft was weak. And yet silence itself wasn't neutral either. It was weaponized, praised as the ideal, then used to measure obedience. It was a trap with no exit. Speak, and you're shamed. Stay quiet, and you're invisible. One telling detail is how women's songs outside ritual often slipped into the category of indecency. A work song sung too loudly while pounding grain, a love song murmured in a courtyard. Both could invite scolding or worse. The idea was that melody itself drew attention, and attention was synonymous with dishonor. Sound was suspicion. The female voice became a kind of acoustic pollution. The most biting irony is that the same societies that wanted women mute still needed their sound to mark the rhythms of daily life. Mothers called children, wives gave instructions in kitchens, sisters exchanged jokes, but these were confined, enclosed, almost domesticated forms of voice. Once a word floated out into public space, it wasn't just sound anymore, it was scandal. This constant framing of women's voices as shameful built a culture of self-surveillance. Generations of daughters learned to modulate, to whisper, to swallow words before they escaped. And what does a swallowed word become? Sometimes it rots into silence, but sometimes it ferments into a different form of sound. The private, sanctioned cries that appeared in the next arena: birth, death, and ritual lament. For all the anxiety about women's voices spilling into public life, there were two thresholds where silence simply wouldn't do: when someone was coming into the world, and when someone was leaving it. At these moments, communities turned to women precisely because their voices, so often framed as pollution, were believed to carry the power to guide the fragile boundary between life and death. Take mourning. In many places, the soundscape of grief was deliberately entrusted to women, not because anyone thought them freer, but because their crying could be weaponized as ritual necessity. Professional mourners emerged, sometimes paid, sometimes coerced, to unleash wails that pierced the air, rising and falling in waves designed to mimic the tearing of the soul. These weren't spontaneous sobs. They were cultivated, rhythmic, sometimes choreographed. Sound turned into social obligation. The louder and longer the lament, the greater the honor to the deceased. Silence, in this context, wasn't dignity, it was disrespect. Birth followed a similar pattern. In huts and chambers, female voices filled the air with chants, whispered mantras, or sharp cries of encouragement. The woman in labor was rarely alone. She was surrounded by others whose voices became both a rhythm and a shield. Some cultures believed that these sounds protected against evil spirits hovering nearby, eager to snatch the newborn before its first breath. The sound of women, paradoxically so feared in public, was here thought to guard life itself. But the license to make noise didn't come without strings attached. These moments of sanctioned sound were temporary and bound tightly to ritual. Once the baby cried, or once the body was buried, the permission expired. The voice that had been sacred an hour earlier was suddenly suspect again. The same woman who sang the spirit into the world could be punished for speaking too freely in the marketplace. There's a dark humor in all this. The most despised voices became indispensable at the moments society feared most. Death and birth are the ultimate equalizers. But even here, women's voices weren't valued for themselves. They were instruments, tools to mark transitions, noise to be turned on and off, like a drum struck only at the right beat. And yet, within these boundaries, something else survived. These rituals preserved fragments of women's sound traditions, songs, chants, tonal patterns passed down from one generation to the next. They became the archives of what society otherwise tried to erase. Even when the broader world dismissed women's voices as shameful, these ritualized moments gave them a place to echo, however narrowly defined. Still, the hypocrisy was blatant. A woman could howl her throat raw at her husband's funeral, but if she spoke too sharply to him while alive, she was branded disobedient. It's as if her voice only carried value when paired with someone else's suffering. In many traditional codes of behavior, a woman's voice wasn't simply her own. It was a family emblem, an audible banner flapping in the wind of public opinion. If her words drifted into the wrong ears, they didn't just reflect on her, they tarnished her parents, her husband, sometimes an entire lineage. A single shout in anger could ripple outwards, dragging the names of men into the mud. Which meant, of course, the solution was simple: cut the voice down before it had the chance to fly. Some law codes spelt it out in blunt detail. Women were to speak with modesty, a phrase so vague it essentially meant only when we feel like hearing it. The definitions of acceptable speech shifted constantly. Ask a question at the wrong time, immodest. Laugh a little too loudly at a neighbor's joke, immodest. Raise your voice in defense against an accusation, immodest. It was less about volume than about visibility. The more others noticed you, the more dishonor spread. There was also the constant equation between voice and sexuality. A woman's sound was imagined as a kind of exposure, as though words were flesh made audible. This is why public performance was so fraught. A man reciting poetry in the street, celebrated; a woman reciting poetry, scandalous. Her voice carried erotic weight whether she intended it or not, and that weight dragged her reputation into suspicion. Communities handled this paranoia in inventive ways. Some required that women's voices be mediated, spoken through a male guardian, reported by a witness, or delivered in whispers that couldn't carry beyond the threshold of the house. Others went further still, decreeing that certain occasions demanded absolute silence. A trial, a council debate, a legal dispute, a woman's sound was out of place. Her testimony could be reduced to gestures or relayed second-hand by a man. The irony was grotesque. She might be the only one who saw the event, yet her voice was treated as unclean evidence, like food tainted by impurity. And yet, the very intensity of the restrictions reveals something. If voices were so carefully managed, it's because they carried enormous social power. Men feared them not because they were weak, but because they could sting. A well-aimed insult, a rumor, a truth spoken too bluntly, these had the ability to unravel reputations. Silence wasn't just protection, it was control. This anxiety shows up most clearly in marriage. A wife's speech reflected directly on her husband's honor. If she was too outspoken, it wasn't simply her problem, it was his humiliation. Stories circulate of men mocked by neighbors because their wives couldn't keep quiet. In this way, the female voice became a battlefield where male pride and public standing were constantly at stake. But the tension wasn't confined to marriage. It stretched into religion, where women's voices risked not only social shame but spiritual contamination. The divine, after all, was imagined as picky about who was allowed to speak in its presence. Religious spaces had some of the strictest rules about women's voices, and those rules rarely needed explanation. They were simply declared as divine preference, and that was the end of it. The gods, it seemed, were imagined as having delicate ears. Women could sweep the temple floor, carry offerings, even weave the garments for the statues, but open their mouths. That risked upsetting the cosmic balance. Across many traditions, the justification ran the same. The female voice was too disruptive, too tempting, too impure. or all of the above. In sacred gatherings, women were expected to sit in silence, often behind partitions, while men spoke the prayers and recited the rituals. The theology was flexible enough to accommodate endless contradictions. Women might be revered as priestesses in certain corners, yet in others the same act of speaking was condemned as sacrilege. When women's voices did find their way into ritual, it was usually under tightly controlled conditions. Hymns, chants, or laments were permitted, but only in prescribed settings and often within groups. A single woman's solo prayer could be branded dangerous, but a chorus of women singing the same lines suddenly became acceptable. The individuality diluted into collective sound. Even then, the rules kept a sharp edge. If the voices slipped into laughter, gossip, or anything unscripted, they reverted instantly to pollution. The divine prohibition wasn't just about keeping rituals pure, it was about hierarchy. Speech was authority, and by monopolizing it in sacred contexts, men positioned themselves as the official interpreters of the gods. Women's silence was dressed up as piety, when in practice it was obedience. To speak in the temple was to claim a channel to the divine, and that channel had to remain exclusive, lest women start having their own interpretations of what heaven wanted. Still, there were cracks in the system. Certain shrines relied on women's voices for prophecy, their words spilling out in trance, trembling, fragmented, sometimes terrifying. But these exceptions came at a cost. The prophetess was often treated as less than human, a mouthpiece rather than a person, her authority limited to the moments of ecstasy. Once the trance ended, so did her permission to speak. Outside that narrow window, her voice was just as restricted as any other woman's. It's striking, though, how rituals leaned on women precisely when they needed intensity. A morning cry, a birth chant, or a prophetic frenzy was fine, as long as it could be boxed in as temporary. Once the box closed, the prohibition snapped back, which brings us to an even subtler realm of control, the difference between the private and the public. A woman might sing to her child at home, but the second her words drifted into the street, everything changed. The distinction between what a woman could say in the privacy of her home and what she could say in public was a chasm so wide it could swallow her whole. Inside the household, her voice was tolerated, sometimes even needed to soothe the child, direct servants, negotiate food supplies, or gossip with kin. But the moment her words slipped beyond the threshold, her sound was no longer just hers. It became a matter of public order. In some societies, neighbors measured a family's honor by how much or how little they heard from the women of the house. A soft murmur through the walls was fine, but laughter loud enough to reach the street, scandalous. A scolding shout that echoed into the courtyard, disgraceful. Silence wasn't just expected, it was performed, a way of staging respectability in the theater of everyday life. This wasn't merely social policing, it was architectural. Homes were designed to muffle female voices. Thick walls, screened windows, separate quarters, all ensured that what women said in domestic space stayed sealed there. When they did venture outside, they often did so veiled, not only to hide their faces, but also to discourage casual conversation. Words, like glances, were supposed to be carefully rationed. Of course, these boundaries were never entirely watertight. Markets, wells, and festivals pulled women into public life, and their voices inevitably followed. But even then, rules shaped how sound was allowed to travel. A woman bargaining at a stall was expected to keep her tone modest. A song sung too boldly at a festival might invite whispers of indecency. Public speech wasn't forbidden outright. It was hemmed in, trimmed, endlessly measured against invisible standards. There's a bitter irony here. Women were often the primary carriers of oral traditions. They passed down songs, tales, and proverbs with remarkable precision, sustaining cultural memory across generations. Yet this role was meant to remain private, nestled within kitchens and cradles. The very voices that preserved heritage were forbidden from shaping public discourse. The anxiety ran deep because speech was power. To speak in public was to influence outsiders, to sway opinion, to make one's presence felt. For men, this was normal. For women, it was subversion. Every syllable outside the house carried the faint risk of rebellion. But if private voices were tolerated, they weren't always safe. In some places, even within the home, a woman's tone could be monitored by husbands, by in-laws, by the invisible ears of servants. Gossip, complaints, or outright defiance could lead to punishment. So the safest register became the whisper, a careful murmur that communicated enough to sustain relationships without drawing dangerous attention. Yet whispers, like all suppressed sounds, had a way of building pressure, and sometimes that pressure exploded in unexpected places, not through loud declarations, but through coded songs, ritualized laments, and sly jokes that carried deeper meanings than they seemed. Which leads naturally to another curious device, the art of disguising speech in performance, where a woman's voice could be both present and invisible at the same time. Music and ritual provided one of the few loopholes through which women's voices could slip into the public ear without punishment. A spoken word might be scandalous, but a sung one, that could be excused as tradition, as performance, as something not entirely personal. In many cultures, women were entrusted with laments for the dead, wailing, chanting, and improvising lines that blended grief with social commentary. It was an odd irony. Their ordinary voices were too disruptive, but when channeled into sorrow, they became indispensable. These laments weren't just background noise for funerals. They could be sharp, coded critiques. A widow might sing of her husband's virtues but slip in biting remarks about his stinginess or cruelty. Mothers mourning their sons could weave in complaints about the endless wars that snatched boys from their families. The lament, framed as pure grief, became a socially acceptable outlet for truths no one dared say outright. Beyond death rituals, songs filled domestic spaces, lullabies, work chants, and festival tunes carried by women's voices in ways that defied silencing. Yet the disguise was always fragile. If the song strayed from accepted patterns, it risked being branded as indecent, even dangerous. A melody of joy sung too loudly could be condemned as shameless. A rhythmic chant muttered at the wrong time might be recast as witchcraft. There's also the curious case of ritualized crying. In some places, women were hired to mourn strangers, their practiced voices trained to draw out grief from the community. Their crying was both theater and therapy, but also tightly controlled. They could raise their voices only for someone else's dead, never for their own frustrations. To weep for wages was acceptable. To weep for personal rage was disorderly. Songs weren't always sad, of course. Festival chants and harvest celebrations often relied on women's choruses. But these were collective, structured, predictable sound that could be absorbed into the group without threatening male authority. The moment an individual woman's voice pushed through, claiming attention, the line was crossed. Performance was allowed only if it masked individuality, reducing the voice to part of a collective hum. Still, these disguised forms carried immense weight. Entire cultural memories, genealogies, myths, secret histories often lived inside songs sung by women in kitchens, fields, and courtyards. They weren't credited as historians, but their verses outlasted many written records. The disguised voice became the real archive, humming beneath the radar of official silence. Yet no loophole was permanent. The disguised voice, for all its power, remained vulnerable to sudden reclassification. A chant could turn into an accusation, a lullaby into a scandal, a lament into evidence of rebellion. Which brings us to the harsher edge of these rules. What happened when women stepped over the invisible line and used their voices where they weren't permitted? When the invisible boundary of acceptable speech was crossed, the response was rarely subtle. A woman who raised her voice at the wrong time or in the wrong place could find herself facing punishments that were as inventive as they were brutal. Words might seem intangible, but societies treated them like weapons and punished women as though they had drawn blood. In many villages, the first line of defense was ridicule. A woman who spoke too loudly, interrupted men, or questioned authority might be mocked in public. Her voice imitated in exaggerated tones, her reputation shredded into gossip. Ridicule worked like a slow poison. It marked her as dangerous, even if her words were ordinary. Once laughter turned against her, silence often returned on its own. But when ridicule failed, harsher measures followed. Some communities treated women's voices as forms of pollution. Speaking at religious gatherings, in council meetings, or during male rituals could be punished with exile, temporary or permanent. The banished woman wasn't merely cast out from one conversation. She was pushed to the edge of survival, forced to live on scraps or wander until another group reluctantly absorbed her. In other places, the punishments came inside the household. A wife who contradicted her husband in public might face beatings once the door closed. Domestic silence was enforced with fists, as though words could be physically beaten back into the throat. Records and oral traditions make it clear. Women who dared to speak too much were often marked by bruises rather than applause. There were also ritualized punishments. In some societies, women accused of loose tongues were forced to perform acts of public humiliation, carrying heavy loads through the village, kneeling in dust, or shaving their heads. A silenced woman became a spectacle, her punishment staged for others as a reminder. It wasn't just about controlling her, it was about warning everyone else. The most extreme punishments linked voice to accusations of witchcraft. To speak too boldly, to argue too cleverly, or to sing too strangely could trigger suspicion of sorcery. And sorcery trials rarely ended with mere silence. They ended with fire, drowning, or stones. The line between voice and life itself was dangerously thin. All of this reveals a grim paradox. Women's voices were feared precisely because they mattered. If they had truly been meaningless, there would have been no need to punish them with such intensity. Silence wasn't natural. It was violently manufactured. And yet, for all these punishments, women continued to find ways of bending the rules. Whispered networks thrived, coded speech survived, and voices carried on under new disguises, which leads naturally into the lingering irony that the suppression of women's voices left deep scars, not just on individuals, but on the entire cultural memory of humanity. The rules that once bound women's voices didn't vanish with the ruins of temples or the fall of empires. They sank deeper, turning into habits, expectations, and unspoken instructions that echoed long after the punishments themselves were gone. What began as ritual taboos became household norms, school lessons, workplace codes. Silence acquired a kind of afterlife. Even today, the ancient idea that a woman's voice should be soft, measured, or rare still lingers. Think of how often girls are praised for being quiet, while boys are admired for being assertive. That's not a quirk of modern parenting. It's the fossil of rules that once banished women to huts, shrines, and the margins of speech. The ghosts of menstrual huts and temple laws drift through classrooms and boardrooms, whispering that a raised female voice is somehow unnatural. Lament traditions left another trace, the expectation that women's voices belong to grief, to funerals, mourning. Complaint remains strangely alive. Anger voiced by a woman is often dismissed as hysteria, but sadness is tolerated, even welcomed. It's the old paradox dressed in new clothes. A woman can cry in public but not argue, weep aloud but not demand. There's also the lasting connection between voice and danger. Historically, when women spoke too much, societies feared witchcraft. Today, the accusations have changed their language but not their tone. Manipulative, shrill, nagging, these are the modern spells, cast to reduce women's words to curses rather than contributions. The categories have shifted, but the structure is the same. And of course, the legacy is uneven. In some places, women have reclaimed their voices with startling force, writing, singing, leading. In others, silence is still enforced through shame, threat, or law. The persistence of these patterns shows just how tenacious cultural memory can be. You can dismantle an altar, burn a scroll, outlaw a custom, but the logic of control, once installed, doesn't die easily. So, the strange rules that once dictated who could speak, when, and how loudly still cast shadows on everyday life. They remind us that history is never really behind us. It's stitched into the rhythms of the present, and when you listen closely enough, you can almost hear the echoes of those controlled voices, humming beneath the surface of modern noise, waiting for the day when silence is no longer the safest choice.